All right, well, welcome back to class. As a little bit of a recap of what we covered last week, we looked at scientific theories and what the definition of a theory is, basically in common everyday language, versus the way scientists would use it when they define theory. In that it's something that should be well established, that has an explanation of a phenomenon that's well supported by a large body of evidence. And we mentioned several of the most well-known scientific theories, like the theory of evolution, for example, or plate tectonic theory, or the Big Bang theory. And we'll find that a lot of times these are generally accepted as being true, but there's a lot of controversy behind them, and we'll show a little bit on here in a book that I brought in. Couple books here. I should have had those ready. That the theory of evolution is not immune to criticism. In fact, there's many criticisms of the theory of evolution. And in fact, if you asked any evolutionist to explain what they think to be the best evidences of evolution, they'd probably quote one of about 10 or so different commonly accepted evidences of evolution. But we find, if we really look into this, there's a great book published or written by Jonathan Wells called Icons of Evolution. And basically these 10 well-known so-called evidences of evolution, he calls them icons because they're so well established or so well rooted into the evolutionary community. But in looking through the book, you'll find that these evidences are, every single one of them is questionable. In fact, some of them are outright fakes, and some of them are actually frauds, and some of them don't stand up to scientific scrutiny at all. In fact, none of them do. So, but these are presented and he goes in the back of the book and talks about textbooks that are in colleges and high schools that list all, or maybe almost all, of these icons as if they were scientifically proven to be true. So again, this stuff, when it gets embedded, it's very difficult to get rid of. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the class today as well. But it causes these people who believe in this to not even investigate any opposing views, which I think, again, is most disturbing, in that science should be about trying to find the truth and not looking into competing theories and seeing if they are, have any merit to them. They dismiss them outright. And I think this is just bad science. We also last week discussed that every scientific theory basically has some starting or underlying assumptions, and that if we can explain these observations correctly using few assumptions, in fact, the fewer the better, then our confidence in the explanation would increase. And in the case of Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory, I think this is certainly the case, and I think you'll see this as we get into this further over the next few weeks. So when we discussed earlier the basic assumption of hydroplate theory, basically are that the Bible's account of six-day creation is true. It's a true account of history, and the evidence really shows that too, scientific evidence, and also that that God created. At the end of the creation, basically stated that everything in his creation was good, or exceedingly good, actually. And so there wouldn't have been anything in that created universe at that point that would have been harmful to humans. And so we would see many of Earth's present conditions, such as volcanoes and earthquakes and tornadoes and avalanches and radioactivity and comets and asteroids and meteorites, wouldn't be expected to have been aspects of this created world, because they've been shown to be actually harmful to humans. They've caused much damage and death. And we'll also show that scientific principles, that all these harmful aspects of the earth can be traced back to actually being a consequence of the Great Flood. So, and this is what Dr. Brown goes through in much of his book. But the major assumption behind hydroplate theory we talked about last week is represented in the slide here, in that when the earth was created, it was created with surface water. and then there was an expanse or a granite crust about 60 miles thick, and then there was another layer of water, subterranean water, that was about 60 miles below the surface under this crust, and it was approximately a mile thick, and then below that was the mantle. So this becomes the major assumption of the hydroplate theory. And we're going to go through the phases of what Dr. Brown describes as the phases of the hydroplate theory. There's 4 phases. One is the rupture phase, which is when the flood starts. The flood phase, of course, is when the whole earth is covered with water. There's a drift phase, in which we'll see the continents or these hydroplates actually move. And then after that, it's called a recovery phase. And these first 3, of course, occur during the flood. And the 4th, or the recovery phase, begins at the later stages of the flood, but certain aspects of this phase are actually continuing to today. We see this again with all these natural disasters that we have. Those are consequences of the flood, and that's part of the recovery phase. So in addition to scientific evidence, I think we also need to confirm that this starting assumption is consistent with Scripture. And so the Bible, of course, isn't really a science textbook. It doesn't tell us how these things happen. But it is a book full of historical accounts, and many of the passages found in Scripture do relate to creation. And as we'll discover, this initial arrangement of the pre-flood earth. And you might be surprised to see how well this assumption is supported in Scripture. There's actually a number of biblical references to this surface water, outer shell crust, subterranean chambers, and then mantle below arrangement. And so I want to start looking at these passages today. The all-important passage is Genesis 1, 6 through 8. And there's several words in this passage that have caused some debate and some controversy, and have been used to attack the scientific validity of the Genesis creation account. So we want to cover these words in some detail here. And as you'll soon see, this correct understanding of this particular verse is of utmost importance in explaining the pre-flood conditions and this arrangement that we see here. And this makes it possible for the earth to be completely covered by water when the great flood occurs, as recorded in Genesis 6 through 8. So as we look into this passage, I want to reread Genesis 7:11 first, so we have that verse fresh in our mind. So what I believe is being described here is a result, or is made possible by what happens in Genesis 1, 6 through 8. And so it's critical, I think, to understand this passage and how it relates back to Genesis 1, 6 through 8. So the Bible states, of course, that God created the heavens and the earth during the creation week, and then approximately 1656 or so years later, in Genesis 7:11, he tells us that in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the springs or fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. So we should realize first that rain alone couldn't cover the entire surface of the earth. Even the pre-flood earth, it didn't have high enough mountains. It didn't have the high mountains that we have now on present earth, but there wouldn't have been possible for that pre-flood surface waters to have completely covered the earth. So if we look at the water cycle today, we see that rain forms through a cycle of evaporation, and then condensation, and then precipitation. So water evaporates from bodies of water, rises into the atmosphere, and then forms clouds through condensation. And when the water droplets in the clouds grow large enough, they fall back to the earth as rain. So the surface water that was present prior to the flood simply could have never covered the entire surface of the earth and the top of the mountains by 20 feet or more of water, as Scripture tells us, 15 cubits. That would have been impossible. So logically, there must have been another source of the water to be able to cover the entire surface of the earth. So reading 7:11 completely gives us the answer. It seems that the key answer here would be to determine just what these springs or fountains of the great deep are. And other than rain, this is the only description of that source of water that Moses gives us in this account of the flood of Noah's day. And then furthermore, the very next verse of Genesis 7 in verse 12 then states that rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And also verse 19 says that sometime during these 40 days, all of the high mountains were covered by water. We're not sure exactly in this 40 days when that occurs, but sometime during that 40-day period, that's when the mountains are completely covered and the entire surface of the earth is completely covered by water. So obviously this is not ordinary rain, right? The Hebrew word used for rain in this passage is called geshem. And there are several words for rain in the Old Testament, but geshem rain is different. It is best thought of as a torrential downpour or deluge, kind of like the earth has never been countered before or probably since. So there's a Hebrew word called matar, it's M-A-T-A-R, and this means normal rain. Violent rain is geshem rain, which is used here in Genesis 7:11 and in chapter 8, verse 2. And it's sometimes accompanied by high winds and huge hailstorms that can destroy mortared walls. We see this recorded in Ezekiel 13:11 through 13. So another issue, of course, is that for the rain to be sustained for 40 straight days and nights, there need to be some very special circumstances in order for this to be able to be sustained for that length of time. Especially not ordinary rain, right? This wasn't ordinary rain. This was a torrential downpour. This was, you've probably been in a really torrential downpour at some point in time, right? This one was probably beyond that, and it lasted continuously for 40 days and 40 nights. Also, most people do seem to focus on the rain for 40 days and 40 nights, thus assume that the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. And this is a common misunderstanding, and we'll discuss this a bit more in depth later, but the flood lasted much longer than that. It actually lasted 371 days. So it's interesting also that we are told that the waters continue to rise at the end of the 40 days. So at the end of 40 days, the windows of heaven are shut off, and rain no longer falls. This geshem rain no longer falls, but the waters continue to rise. Keep that in mind as we'll go through this a little bit later on, but this is very interesting when we get to this. How could water continue to rise even after the rain stops and cover the entire surface of the earth? Of course, as Genesis 7, 19, and 20 tell us. So I want to start in the beginning, basically, where the Bible records the details of those assumed starting conditions in the creation account of Genesis 1. So if we read Genesis 1 verse 2, that occurred on day 1 of the creation week, and it states, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface or face of the waters." So the Hebrew word here for waters is mayim. It's M-A-Y-I-M. And this word is always used to describe liquid water. And some have attempted to explain these waters in verse 2 as if it was a frozen or gaseous vapor, but Hebrew does not use the word mayim to describe those states of water. And as we'll talk about probably a little later today, this is one of the major flaws of what's called the vapor canopy theory, which is one of the other two competing flood models. One has been pretty well discarded, but not entirely, unfortunately. But Hebrew also has many other words to describe other states of water, such as ice, clouds, and vapor. So clearly, liquid water is what is intended to be understood, I think, here in this passage, by the use of this word mayim. Also, the Hebrew word for deep here is tehom. It's spelled T-E-H-O-M, and it has a meaning of depth or deep of the earth, in the earth, and has an associated meaning of something dark or being controlled by a mysterious force. It's kind of got all this kind of wrapped up in this meaning of this word. And the Hebrew word for surface or face used here is panah, which is P-A-N-E-H, and it's used primarily to mean a presence or an appearance or to be in front of. And this is kind of much like we would use the phrase when we would use the phrase "in the face of danger," right? So we are in the presence of a dangerous situation. It's kind of similar to that kind of usage. So stating that the Spirit of God was moving over the surface or the face of the waters clearly indicates that God is present and is causing all these things to happen. And then on the second day of creation, God said in Genesis 1:6, "Let there be a vault or firmament or expanse," depending on the translation, and we'll get into this in just a few minutes too. And the Hebrew word translated here as vault, firmament, or expanse is the word rakia. That's R-I-Q-I-A. And it's said to be in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from waters. And here we see a key word in this passage. This is the key word of this passage. So there was an expanse, and this is expanse that was created that separated liquid water, and some of that water, about half, was above this solid firm expanse, and about half of it was below this solid firm expanse. And we'll see as we look at these words in this passage that there are words that mean to divide in half or to split in half. So hydroplate theory proposes, go back far. So hydroplate theory proposes that this is the starting conditions. And so we'll want to see, of course, is there scientific support for this? But I think starting with this, we want to look at, again, the biblical support for this. And the scientific support for this understanding will be kind of the following section after we look at the biblical support here. So let's look back at the biblical account in even more detail here. So to try to understand Genesis 1, 6 through 8a even better, let's study all the key words in this passage, including the most important word in this passage, which is this Hebrew word rakia. So the key words found in this passage here are waters, which is mayam, we just talked about that. To separate or to divide is badal. In the midst of is tavek. The word heaven is shemayam. And the expanse, vault, or firmament, of course, is rakia. And all these words have significance, of course. But we're going to look first into rakia. So the second day of creation centers around this word. Just as the third day dealt with plants and the fourth day dealt with the heavenly bodies, this is the key word here in this passage. So what was the rakia? This has been thought of as one of the most mysterious words in the Bible, and because of some controversy here. So we want to look at these words beginning here with rakia. But I think what we first want to point out is that, you and I all speak Hebrew. I'm sorry, you speak English, right? I barely speak English, but we don't speak Hebrew, right? So part of this issue is determining exactly what's meant by this passage. What does the original Hebrew term really mean? And of course, they have to be translated into English. And this has led, unfortunately, to some different possible meanings, because translations from Hebrew to English, we'll look at this in just a minute, many translations use completely different words for the same original Hebrew word. So realize that according to Wikipedia, they state that the Bible has been translated into 736 different languages. And if we look at the number of translations that are in English, there are around 450 translations. So how could so many different translations be completely faithful to the intent and words of the original author? Many of them use completely different English words for the same original Hebrew word. I've found that comparing some of the most popular English translations of the same passages is very beneficial. Bible Gateway is a website, if you're not familiar with it, where you can go and you can do this. You can put a specific passage in, and you can then have it show all the translations, the common translations, or the most popular translations, side by side of the same passage. Very, very helpful. Again, one word we're going to look into is the Hebrew word shemayim, which is usually translated as heaven. That's relative to what we're discussing in these passages, to the word rakia, because we'll see in the passage that God names the rakia shemayim. This is very significant here. But we need to, again, look back and try to realize that different translations of the Bible, of course, are done by humans, who are fallible, and they have biases, and of course make mistakes. And usually in most Bible translations, there's a committee of scholars that work together to translate the Bible from its original words to try to minimize mistakes or biases. There are actually some Bibles that were translated by a single person too, and those are ones that probably would raise a little bit of a red flag of caution. if you want to use a translation like this. But there actually is one that I think is really good. It's called Young's Literal Translation. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So a bias, of course, is a disproportionate weight or favor against or for an idea, something that causes us to be closed-minded or unfair sometimes. Sometimes they're very difficult or impossible to overcome. Sometimes you don't even realize that you have a bias. And I would like to think that if presented with evidences that are contrary, that are solid evidences that you can confirm for a particular scientific theory, let's say, that I would change my mind about something if presented with the right evidence. That's not so easy to do. I used to think that all the evolutionists were correct, because of, how could all the evolutionists be wrong, right? There were so many of them. So this is kind of like consensus. This is a false thinking that just because the majority thinks a certain way doesn't make it right. It's not something you vote on, right? Truth isn't something you vote on. So I think, again, the point of this is that we need to kind of use some caution, I guess, when looking at some of these words, and look at different translations and get a good concordance too. A good concordance will really help you out quite a bit to see what the original words meant back in the time that they were actually written. So to illustrate this, I want to read several English translations of Genesis 1:6 through 8, and you'll see that the meanings appear to be different in these popular translations. So looking specifically at the words Rakia and Shemayim. So here's the New King James Version. And Rakia here is translated as firmament, and Shemayim is translated as heaven. Also notice in this passage, the one key item to note is that God first creates the Rakia and then names it Shemayim. So you'll see this, of course, in other translations as well. But the New King James reads, "Then God said, let there be a firmament, or Rakia, in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And thus God made the firmament, the Rakia, and divided the waters which are under the firmament, Rakia, from the waters which are above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament, Rakia, heaven, Shemayim. So the evening and morning were the second day." So it's stated that God says, let there be a division or a firmament or a Rakia in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from waters. And then it says God did it. Right? In the next sentence, it says, and God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above. So it's interesting here that God states what he's going to do. In the next sentence, he does it, and then he tells us what he names it. However, other versions of the Bible, such as the New American Standard, translate Rakia as expanse. So reading this translation, we see, and then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from waters. And God made the expanse, or Rakia again, separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was morning and evening and a second day. So here, like the King James Version, the NASB translates Rakia as heaven. Young's Literal Translation is another kind of a lesser-known translation, one I just mentioned here, done by a man named Young, and it was a single person that did this, but he tried to translate the original words literally as they were written. And it's a translation that I've come to use here and there when I find some specific Hebrew words that are maybe difficult, because he translated them quite literally. And sometimes it doesn't read very smooth because of that in English, but it's attempting to convey what is intended by the original author. And in this passage, the Young's Literal Translation reads, and God saith, let an expanse, Rakia, be in the midst of the waters, and let it be separating waters from waters. And God maketh the expanse, and separate between the waters which are under the expanse, and which are above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heavens, and there was evening and morning, day second. Now here's how the NIV translates this passage. This is where it starts to get a little bit interesting here. The NIV states, and then God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water from under the vault, from the water above it. And it was so, and God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now there's some other translations that also call the Rakia sky, which I find this very curious. God names the vault, Rakia, names it sky. Well, that seems very different, right? And this isn't really the same meaning at all here. Now note another translation that I found called the Living Bible. And this translates this verse in something you'll get a totally different picture as to what's actually happening here. And what I want to have you note here in looking at this translation is that it was published in 1971. And the key thing about that is that this is 10 years after the Genesis flood book was published by Henry Morris. And Henry Morris is still considered to be one of the founding creation scientists, but he was a big advocate of what's called the vapor canopy theory. So vapor canopy theory we're going to discuss in just a minute here. But this translation, this newer translation, says, let the vapors separate to form the sky above and the oceans below. So God made the sky, dividing the vapor above from the water below. This all happened on the second day. So in the footnotes of this passage in this translation, they state that the phrase let the vapors separate literally states, let there be a dome to divide the waters. As we stated previously here, though, the Hebrew word for vapors wasn't mayim. Mayim was always used to describe liquid water only and not vapor. And so this passage here, this translation coming 10 years after Henry Morris's book came out, appears to have influenced the translator. And again, as we go through vapor canopy theory, you'll see exactly why they may have translated this passage this way. So again, this is why I'm saying you have to use caution with this. You have to look kind of deeply in some of these different passages and different translations to make sure that you're getting the correct meaning here. I think this is a totally incorrect meaning to this passage. Yes, sir.
So I'm sitting here reading while you're talking and stuff, and what I'm seeing is one of the that comes from the root word raka.
Yeah, we're going to get to
raka. Are you getting to that?
Yep. You're reading my mind. Next slide, right? So, just be patient. You read my mind here. Since the focus of Genesis 1, 6 through 8 is rakia, let's look into this word. And as we've seen English translations, we see rakia is generally translated as vault, expanse, and firmament. But what did this word originally mean? Well, its original meaning is a little uncertain. Its root word, raka, means to spread out, to beat out, stamp, or hammer, as somebody would do with a malleable metal. It can also be used to mean plate, to plate something, and is used for an example when an item is plated by a thin layer of gold, for example. So by carefully studying English meanings of these root words for rakia, which is raka, baka, and bakia, one can see that today's understanding of the word firmament or expanse or sky as atmosphere, sky, or outer space doesn't really relate to these root words very well. And thus, logically, it changes the original meaning of the word rakia. Instead, we get really a picture of a hammered out or pressed out solid, not the sky. In other words, we just read the NIV where it names the rakia sky, which I think is wrong. Again, we'll look at that word shemayim in a minute as well. But realize that, again, and probably few people really even know, that due to the forces of gravity, all rock around the Earth that's 5 miles or more below the surface of the Earth would be pressed out, basically, due to the intense forces of gravity that is exerted on this rock, due to the rock that's above it and just gravitational forces. And also, if this rock is confined and has nowhere to go, basically, the intense pressures of all this weight, that rock actually somewhat becomes tar-like or putty-like. It actually has a, you can't see this, of course, but it actually becomes somewhat malleable, and it actually will flow, although slowly, will be pressed out, just as the root word rakia suggests. So it's really interesting when you start putting all these things kind of together, at least I think it is, to look at this in what this word meant, and then look at the science behind it, because that weight actually would spread out or stamp out, basically, the surface of the earth. So raka is used in the Old Testament in several places for stamping out metal into a sheet. So gold is a good example of this process. Gold is malleable, of course, and people can use a hammer or other tool to flatten it and stretch it into very, very thin sheets. We see this occurring in Numbers chapter 8, verse 4. But we also must remember that context always determines the meaning of a word, not just the etymology of the word, or how it may be used in other verses. So we need to ask ourselves, why did the author use this word to describe the expanse? What property did the author intend us to understand by using this word rakia? And is it possible that the author intended to get across this state of a solid nature of this expanse? So here in chapter 1, again, we want to look at this a little deeper to make sure we have a list, we understand what this means. And it's also of importance to note that the first 4 uses of rakia found here in verses 6 and 7 can be distinguished from the last 4 uses found later in the creation week. They're found in Genesis 1:14 through 20. So there's 9 times that rakia is used here. There's 5 times it's used in the Genesis 1:6 through 8 passage, and that's used 4 more times later. Clearly from the context of the last 4 times that it's used, the words of the heavens are added to rakia. So that distinguishes it. It gives it kind of a different meaning. It distinguishes the difference between the last 4 uses and the first 4 uses. So I think you'll find this both biblically and the scientific evidence of this expanse being described here in the first 4, I think, refers to the Earth's crust. So surface waters which will become oceans and seas and lakes and rivers on day 3 when dry land appears, these surface waters were above the crust and the subterranean waters were below. And then later, of course, in Genesis 7:11, it's these subterranean waters that burst forth, producing the fountains of the great deep and the global flood. And you'll see this too in other passages I'll cover too. It's not just here. So let's take a look at this text a little bit here. If you look at this actual text, it will become clear that there's a difference between the uses of rakia in Genesis 1. So in verse 6 through 20, we look at the use of rakia. There's 9 times. You can count 9 different times, highlighted in red there, that rakia is used. And in Genesis 1:6 through 8, it's different than the following passages in 11 through 20. It's another example, again, why it's important to look back at these original words. And not doing this can hamper our correct understanding of this passage, because when you add of the heavens, we'll see here, this qualification, vault firmament of the heavens, is added. It changes the meanings of this word. So they're different in some way, right? Why weren't the first 4 qualified the same way? If it meant sky or outer space or anything else other than a solid expanse, why weren't those first 4 uses qualified with this of the heavens? This is very dramatic. I mean, why this clarification? It should really alert us that there's probably something meant different in the first 4 times versus the last 4 times. Just as this happens with countless other words, rakia came to have several meanings. Just like the word crust can mean the outer surface of a loaf of bread, or it can mean the outer plate or the surface of the earth. Gravity keeps us firmly planted on Earth, just as it keeps the crust of the earth firmly in place. It also keeps the planets and stars firmly in place in the heavens. It does both. So from this, I think we can see that rakia had its first meanings as the crust of the earth as used here in the first 4 occurrences of Genesis 1, where God rocketh the earth, and he rocketh the earth above the waters of the great deep. And again, this is significant. Then it could be used in context to mean outer space, when of the heavens is added to it. So this is how important this is. So when this is added, this out of the heavens is added to the term rakia, it clearly means outer space in the context. So this is where God creates in the 3rd day, verses 14 through 20. This is when he creates the heavenly bodies. Clearly this has a different meaning, right? Because the context of that, he's talking about outer space. He's creating the stars and the planets and the galaxies and the sun and the moon. So this is not the same as the first 4 uses of rakia. Unfortunately, this is not cause confusion, But if you look at it this way, I think it's clear. Does this make this clear? I hope that it does. That this word has different meanings depending on how it's used here, in the context here. So what about the 5th usage here? We looked at the first 4 and the second 4 uses of rakia, but what about the 5th? In context, the first 4 uses now I think should be understood in context as the original word rakia, with the meaning, again, referring to the earth's crust. We'll also see God places a great deal of water above and below the crust in verses 9 and 10 as land is formed. So the last 4 uses we certainly are referring to something out of space, but what about this 5th usage? This fifth usage of raka in Genesis 1 is found in chapter 1, verse 8, and it's the middle use of the 9 times found here in this chapter, where God now names the rakia. So in this passage, God named the rakia vault, firmament, or he named it heaven. He named it Shemayim, basically, is the word that's used here. So we want to look into that a little bit as well. So why does Genesis 1:8 state that God named the expanse heaven? So this leads to kind of 2 possible interpretations of Genesis 1:8 in that 5th usage of the word. So here's the 2 possible interpretations. So the expanse meant outer space or atmosphere. And most likely this is a common accepted interpretation of rakia in this passage. And due to our modern misunderstanding of the word firmament, this would naturally be how most people would interpret the meaning here. The word firmament is an interesting word too, which we'll get to in just a second. But it's come to mean today, firmament kind of means sky, right, or atmosphere. That's not what it originally meant, though. The meanings have changed. That's, again, why you have to go back and look at these original meanings. Also, when most people think of the word heaven, it would naturally lead them to think of what's termed the present heaven, and that the present intermediate heaven that is distinctly separate from the earth. But realize that this passage is describing a time before the fall in Genesis 3, when the present state or the immediate state that we're in now actually began. So there's kind of like 3 sections of history. There's past, pre-fall, present state we currently live in, and then there's a future state when everything's restored back to the original pre-fall state. Everything's remade new. There's no more death, no more dying, no more disease, no more crime. That happens in Revelation, right? So we have to realize here there's an important difference. So this Hebrew term rakia, this doesn't seem to fit, meaning what we think of sometimes as heaven or sky. The second meaning of the expanse could mean heaven. This is the place where God dwelt, the original paradise. Recall that God walked and talked with Adam in Genesis 3, verses 8 and 9. So heaven was originally on earth. This was heaven. To Adam and Eve, this would have been heaven to them.